so if we know that consumer surplus is ultimately determined by the interaction of supply and demand, then we know that it will be those factors that start to affect it. So, for example, if we look at the idea of shifts in a supply curve, price, quantity, demand, supply, what direction would we like supply to go in to increase consumer surplus? Expand or contract? Expand. So supply moves to S2. We've got Q2, E2, P2, and this area here then becomes the increase in consumer surplus. What do we know is something that governments could do, or a particular government body that could encourage supply to shift in that manner? Yeah, don't disagree with that. Subsidies can help with that process. What's one of the things that we mentioned as Pints WC that we want to create in markets to benefit consumers? Pints WC. Yeah, so do you think about the idea of N on your Pints WC? If we can increase the number of firms, i.e. more competition, that will benefit consumers. So increase the number of firms, therefore increase consumer surplus. What government organisation, can you remember what it was called that's in charge of that? Yeah, CMA. Okay, can you remember what it stands for?
Market Authority.
Yes, Competition and Market Authority. Okay, so it will be their job to increase competition. That benefits us as consumers because we can then start to see an increase in our consumer surplus. So we've got shifts in the supply curve. And just to point out, obviously if we went in the opposite direction, what's going to happen to that area?
Decrease.
It will decrease, you would lose it. So you just got to see what direction things are moving in. In contrast to that, if we look at the idea of elasticity, so price, quantity, if you want to see the difference between the two, if we draw two different types of elastic supply curve, price, quantity, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it on one diagram, it'll be easier. So what type of supply curve would I describe that as? Inelastic, excellent. I then have a more elastic supply curve. Let's just draw a demand curve in there as part of that process. So there are either shifts in supply or the idea of elasticity. So here's my equilibrium, E, E2. So the colour in that little box, here you can imagine is my consumer surplus. But if we look at a more elastic supply curve, P, P2, Q, Q2. And just to point out, in terms of getting our labelling accurate, if I've got this whole area here, if I can make the supply curve more elastic, the orange area is the increase. Okay, it's the increase, because if it was the overall consumer surplus, that blue area would still be part of that consumer surplus for the more elastic curve. Okay? So what we've got here is the increase in consumer surplus from a more elastic PES. What are the things that we've spoken about that can influence the elastic nature of a supply curve? 4 things.
Time.
Time frame,
Wait.
complexity.
The cost.
What do you mean when you say cost?
The cost to supply it.
Not necessarily the cost factor of it. That's PED, price as a percentage of income. The idea of its initial cost is similar, but I mean, if it's expensive to obtain it, it just means that the price goes up as part of it. But if it's readily available, you can still go out and buy it. What was it that often causes the price of raw materials to go up when they are scarce? So it's the scarcity of the materials. If you can't get your hands on it, you simply cannot supply it regardless of what that price point is. So we've got scarcity, complexity, the kind of time frame of short run, long run, and duration. Okay. Now, if you imagine for certain items, so again here, if you think about the government, what industries have we seen government create regulation that means it takes longer to produce these things and it's harder and more complex, for example, that's created a shortage for the population? What is it that we would all like to own at some point in our lives? House. So housing has heavy regulation. What have they done that's made land more scarce? What have they said that you cannot do? Build in certain locations. So you could imagine the government could seek to change regulation. So for example, i.e. with house building, if you reduced what we call like the red tape, then that would free up land, which would then become less scarce. You could reduce regulation, that would make it less complex and increase in terms of quickness to build, and therefore you would receive a great level of consumer surplus for those particular products. Okay? So, as well as supply elasticities, what else is going to affect consumer surplus as well, therefore? If it's going to be shifts in elasticity of supply, demand. Okay? So again, just to illustrate the different components of it, they'll work in different directions. So, supply, demand, S, D, D2, Q, price, Q2, B, E2, and again just highlight the appropriate areas that represent that. So the blue component versus the orange component in terms of old consumer surplus, new consumer surplus, and then again with your elasticities, price, quantity. So let's draw a supply curve. Q, P, Q2, P2, and again, consumer surplus if the PED is elastic, consumer surplus PED is inelastic. Okay. So different factors you might need to analyse based upon a case study.